When we consider the merciless days of the 15th and 16th centuries, one figure loomed large and ominous, an embodiment of terror and the unyielding grip of civic justice that defined an era where life was cheap and codified punishment was everything: the executioner. This highly specialized, often reviled, role was necessary for the state to project its absolute power, making the man behind the mask both a dreaded enemy and a crucial servant of order. Their sheer existence reflected a social contract built on fear, ensuring that the spectacle of punishment served as a perpetual, chilling warning to all citizens. Franz Schmidt served as the official executioner of Nuremberg from 1578 to 1617, and his very name captures the duality of the era. Schmidt was responsible for over 360 recorded executions, and yet his detailed journals reveal not a monster, but a man deeply concerned with his professional duty, piety, and the welfare of his family, a profound contradiction that mirrors the complex morality of the late Renaissance. The fact that a man tasked with such horrific public service maintained such fastidious personal records suggests an attempt to find grace or accountability in a role that offered none. Shrouded in darkness, this grim and enigmatic individual held the power of life and death in his very hands, a power executed with brutal, swift finality that both terrified and fascinated the populace. With a single swing of the axe or the tightening of the noose, the executioner could silence the cries of the condemned forever, transforming judicial mandate into gruesome reality. This inescapable duty meant that when the famed English politician and philosopher Sir Thomas More faced execution in 1535, he reportedly instructed the headsman to wait until he had moved his beard out of the way, showing that even the most distinguished victim recognized the executioner's absolute authority in that final moment. It was a profession that often brought notoriety and profound social isolation, but also a morbid fascination from a society obsessed with morality and death. Despite their civic importance, these individuals were fundamentally feared, existing outside the bounds of polite society, and often seen as tainted by the blood they shed. Yet, the public spectacle of their work ensured that they remained a fixed point in the communal imagination, the ultimate purveyors of justice in an unjust world. Clad in a dark hood to shield their identity from the vengeful gaze of the crowd, the medieval executioner was both despised and reluctantly revered, a walking paradox essential to the stability of the city. The anonymity was not just protection from retribution, but a necessary ritualistic separation, turning the man into an impersonal instrument of state wrath. This deliberate veiling reinforced the notion that it was not a person carrying out the sentence, but the unforgiving machinery of the law itself. In a time when gruesome punishments such as the breaking wheel, drawing and quartering, and burning at the stake were commonplace, the executioner's skill and precision were crucial to a swift, and if possible, merciful end. To botch a public execution was to risk the wrath of the crowd, turning a solemn judicial act into a chaotic riot, highlighting the delicate balance between fear and performance the executioner had to maintain. History notes that following a botched execution in 1681, the executioner of London, Jack Ketch, was subjected to such public scorn that his name became synonymous with clumsiness and cruelty in the macabre trade. Franz Schmidt, in his lifetime, recorded carrying out a staggering 361 executions and numerous other punishments. Yet this numerical accounting only scratches the surface of the psychological weight he bore. His meticulous tally stands as a chilling artifact of bureaucratic violence, showing that even the most intimate acts of killing were logged and accounted for as official transactions of the state. These records remain some of the most detailed primary sources we have on capital punishment in early modern Europe, proving that even in the shadows, these men lived highly documented, regulated lives. But beyond the blood-stained scaffolds and the horrifying spectacle of public executions, who were these men of death? Were they heartless killers or reluctant servants of a brutal system defined by laws they did not write? The answer lies not in their personal malice, but in the necessity of their function, forcing them to become experts in human pain for the sake of societal control. They were the indispensable anchor point of a judicial philosophy that relied on visible, visceral deterrence to maintain order. As the famed French philosopher Voltaire once remarked, "It is forbidden to kill. Therefore, All murderers are punished, unless they kill in large numbers and to the sound of trumpets, a cynical but accurate assessment that captures the ultimate hypocrisy embedded in the executioner's role. The law granted them license to perform acts that would be considered monstrous crimes if committed by any other citizen, elevating state-sanctioned violence above personal vengeance or mere murder. This profound legal distinction is what separated the executioner from the killer. Venture with us now into the shadowy world of the medieval executioner and explore the complex nature of their lives and duties, understanding how this historical role continues to echo in our modern debates about justice, power, and the limits of state authority. The stories of these men are not just historical curiosities, they are a direct confrontation with the enduring question of who we authorize to deliver final judgment. Welcome to the Diary of Julius Caesar, forging a grim fate as we begin to unravel the mechanisms that turned ordinary men into the state's instruments of ultimate judgment. By examining the context and consequence of their actions, we move beyond simple horror to grasp the societal pressures that necessitate such a terrifying office. The making of medieval executioners was less a choice and more often a cruel inheritance, rooted in the social architecture of exclusion and necessity. To be placed in this position required a deep understanding of human anatomy and judicial ritual, acquired through rigorous and often traumatic apprenticeship. During the Middle Ages, the role of an executioner was universally feared and perpetually shunned, yet despite the deep stigma attached to the profession, there were always individuals who chose, or were forced, to become the harbingers of death. To understand the grim journey of a medieval executioner, it is crucial to explore the difficult process of training and apprenticeship that indelibly shaped their lives and careers. In a time when formal education was scarce, the path to becoming an executioner was often paved by family tradition, locking generations into the trade. Many executioners hailed from families that had practiced the trade for decades, ensuring that the specialized knowledge and the associated social taint was meticulously passed down. For instance, the legendary Sanson family served as France's royal executioners for over 2 centuries, from the late 1600s to the early 1800s, demonstrating how deeply institutionalized this occupational lineage truly was. Apprenticeships typically began in early adolescence, with the young apprentice assisting the executioner in various grim tasks, starting with the simplest forms of punishment and disposal. These tasks ranged from performing simple executions such as hanging or drowning to assisting in more complex and gruesome methods like the preparation for drawing and quartering, demanding physical strength and an iron will. Apprentices would also learn to care for and maintain the tools of their trade, such as the executioner's sword, the axe, or even the early versions of the guillotine, recognizing that the tools themselves were sacred, terrifying extensions of the law. One famous historical figure who underwent this type of training was Franz Schmidt, born in 1555 in present-day Germany, the son of a woodsman and a convicted poacher whose path was decided by his stepfather, also an executioner. At the age of 18, Schmidt was formally apprenticed to his stepfather, honing his skills over the years until he eventually became the official executioner of Nuremberg in 1578. A position he held for 45 years and which he carefully recorded in his journal, providing a rare and valuable glimpse into the daily, brutal reality of an executioner's life. Throughout their apprenticeship, aspiring executioners would witness various forms of punishment and execution, desensitizing them to horror and hardening them to the job's psychological demands. They would also become intimately familiar with the accompanying rituals, such as reading the sentence aloud to the condemned or ensuring the body was properly disposed of after the execution, treating the entire process as a formalized religious and legal ceremony. An important part of their education was learning to deal with the overwhelming psychological challenges of their profession, leading many executioners to rely heavily on religion to find solace and justify their actions as instruments of necessary, divine justice. One anecdote from history illustrates the absolute importance of precision in an executioner's work, revealing how quickly competence turned to disaster and infamy. In 1649, when King Charles I of England was to be executed by decapitation, The appointed executioner, Richard Brandon, was reportedly so nervous about his task that he consumed a large amount of alcohol beforehand, resulting in the first blow of his axe failing to sever the king's head, which required a horrifying second strike, a public mishap that only served to emphasize that the executioner's expertise and training were non-negotiable requirements of the state. Occasionally, a famous quote or phrase would emerge from the annals of executioner history, serving as a bleak epitaph for the condemned and the period. One such example comes from Charles-Henri Sanson, who was the chief executioner of France during the French Revolution, and who, upon completing the task of executing King Louis V, reportedly declared, "The king is no more," a simple phrase that symbolized the end of an era, the birth of a new political order, and the executioner's role in ushering in revolutionary change. The instruments of retribution represented the grisly art of medieval execution, where simple tools were made terrifying through the immense power they represented. The physical reality of the instruments, the cold steel, the rough hemp, was the final, unavoidable truth for the condemned. The Middle Ages were marked by a variety of brutal and grisly methods of execution, as rulers and courts across Europe employed these punishments not only as a means to enforce power and deter crime, but sometimes to provide a morbid form of public entertainment. Delving into the dark world of medieval execution methods, we discover the specialized tools and equipment wielded by the executioner, shedding light on the grim spectacles that once captivated and horrified audiences in equal measure. One of the most common methods of execution during the Middle Ages was hanging, reserved primarily for commoners and perceived as a relatively quick and efficient public spectacle. The condemned would be led to a scaffold or gallows, often accompanied by a solemn procession and a priest to administer last rites, creating a highly scripted public event designed to maximize emotional impact. A noose made of hemp rope would be placed around the neck of the condemned, and a skilled executioner would aim for the neck to snap, causing instant death, thereby fulfilling his duty to deliver a swift end. Beheading, another prominent method of execution, was typically reserved for nobility and those of higher social standing, signifying a marginally more honorable, though equally final, end. In England, one of the most famous beheadings was that of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII in 1536. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, Anne was sentenced to be executed by decapitation. The king, however, chose to show some degree of mercy by importing a skilled swordsman from France to perform the execution, rather than using the traditional, heavier axe, illustrating that even in the moment of ultimate punishment, social status dictated the degree of perceived humaneness. Burning at the stake was yet another method of execution in the Middle Ages, often reserved for those accused of heresy or witchcraft, highlighting the intertwining of religious dogma and state punishment. In 1431, Joan of Arc, a French national heroine who claimed divine guidance, was captured by the English and charged with heresy, subsequently being burned at the stake, her execution becoming a potent, tragic symbol of martyrdom that fueled national sentiment. Victims of this gruesome method would be tied to a wooden stake surrounded by flammable materials, and the executioner would then light the pyre, ensuring the condemned perished in the agonizing flames. Drawing and quartering, perhaps one of the most brutal methods of execution, was typically reserved for those convicted of high treason, underscoring that the severity of the punishment directly correlated to the perceived threat against the sovereign. The horrific process involved several stages, including hanging the condemned until nearly dead, followed by disembowelment, beheading, and finally the dismemberment of the body into 4 parts, a ritualistic destruction of the body politic. One of the most infamous instances of this punishment occurred in 1305 when Scottish patriot William Wallace was captured by the English and subjected to this brutal execution method. His death meant to completely annihilate any symbol of resistance. The tools and equipment used by executioners in these methods were both simple and macabre. Axes, swords, and the dreaded executioner's block were the primary tools for beheadings, requiring extreme sharpness and control. For hangings, a well-constructed gallows and a strong hemp rope were the essential components, while burnings demanded a sturdy stake and an abundance of flammable materials to ensure the process was thorough. For drawing and quartering, a sharp knife or blade would be used to carry out the disembowelment and dismemberment, forcing the executioner to be proficient in butchery as well as judgment. In the words of the 16th century poet Francois Villon, "Where are the snows of yesteryear?" These haunting lines remind us that the era of brutal executions in the Middle Ages has long since passed, but the instruments of retribution wielded by executioners still loom large in our collective memory, serving as permanent reminders of humanity's capacity for institutionalized cruelty. By examining the tools and methods employed in these grim spectacles, we gain a deeper understanding of the harsh realities of medieval justice and the harrowing ordeals that once held sway over society. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was yet another horrific tool used to execute criminals. A specialized apparatus designed to prolong suffering and maximize the visual horror for the gathered spectators. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel with their limbs spread out and secured to the spokes, ensuring that all parts of the body were exposed to the forthcoming brutality. The executioner would then use an iron bar or hammer to methodically break the bones of the victim, rendering them incapable of escaping their agonizing fate, a process that could take hours. The wheel would then often be hoisted into the air on a pole, exposing the broken and battered individual to the elements where they would ultimately perish. A living example of the consequences of crime, sometimes left there for days to decay as a permanent, chilling warning. Another method of execution, though less common, was the gruesome practice of boiling alive, reserved for specific crimes deemed particularly heinous, often poisoning. In 1531, Englishman Richard Roos was found guilty of attempting to poison John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, and was sentenced to be boiled alive in a large cauldron filled with water or oil. The executioner would be responsible for overseeing the heating of the cauldron, ensuring that the condemned met their grisly end in this torturous manner, showcasing the inventiveness of medieval punishment. The various methods of execution employed throughout the Middle Ages were undoubtedly brutal and merciless, but they served a distinct, calculated purpose in the minds of the ruling class: total deterrence. By subjecting criminals to these horrifying public punishments, they sought to reinforce their absolute authority, deter would-be transgressors, and maintain a semblance of order in a time when violence and chaos often reigned supreme. Shrouded in darkness, the veiled identity of medieval executioners was not merely a stylistic choice, but a necessary defense mechanism against the inevitable social and personal ramifications of their job. The mask turned a man into a symbol, separating the individual from the terrible duties performed. In the shadows of history, the medieval executioner loomed as a figure of fear and dread, cloaked in darkness both literally and figuratively as these grim enforcers of justice donned distinct attire that served to conceal their identity from the public eye. By exploring the complex reasons behind the executioner's desperate need for anonymity and the distinctive clothing and masks they wore, we uncover a hidden facet of their lives, perpetually entwined with secrecy and social stigma. To fully understand the executioner's need for anonymity, one must first consider the crushing societal context in which they operated. In the Middle Ages, executioners were often ostracized and viewed as social pariahs, considered untouchables whose very touch could convey ill fortune. Their profession was deemed dishonorable, and this stigma extended relentlessly to their families, making it challenging for executioners and their kin to form meaningful relationships with others in their community. Given this severe social isolation, it is unsurprising that executioners sought to maintain some degree of anonymity when performing their duties, minimizing personal exposure. By concealing their identities, they hoped to minimize the risk of violent retribution from the friends or families of those they executed, and reduce the pervasive social stigma that might befall them in their day-to-day lives outside of the scaffold. The attire worn by executioners varied depending on the region and time period, yet some common elements consistently helped to shield their identities from the looking public. One of the most recognizable aspects of the executioner's ensemble was the hood or mask, often made from black cloth or leather, which would entirely cover the executioner's face, leaving only their eyes exposed. In some cases, the hoods were adorned with grotesque and fearsome features, serving both to intimidate the condemned and to further obscure the wearer's true identity, making the figure appear more spectral and less human. In addition to the hood or mask, executioners would typically wear dark, unadorned clothing that would blend into the shadows and prevent them from standing out in a crowd, emphasizing their role as a fleeting instrument of the state. This somber attire often included a long coat or cloak, gloves, and sturdy boots, all of which served to protect the executioner from the grisly nature of their work and kept their identity shrouded in darkness, enforcing their perpetual social distance. While many executioners chose to maintain their anonymity, there were some who gained notoriety and became well-known, even infamous, figures of their time, their names permanently associated with their gruesome deeds. One such individual was Charles-Henri Sanson, the chief executioner of France during the French Revolution, who, despite the widespread knowledge of his profession, was considered a man of integrity and honor, even gaining the reluctant respect of some of his contemporaries. His infamous role in the execution of King Louis V and other high-profile figures during the Revolution cemented his place in history as a key, unavoidable player in a tumultuous period. Another curious anecdote regarding executioner attire involves the 16th century German executioner Franz Schmidt. As the official executioner of Nuremberg, Schmidt was required to wear the traditional hood and cloak while performing his duties, yet upon retiring from his position, he reportedly burned his executioner's attire in a public display, symbolically severing ties with his grim profession and shedding the lifelong stigma associated with it. This act was a powerful, if desperate, attempt to reclaim his personal identity after decades of public dissociation. Outcasts by the blade, the lonesome world of the medieval executioner was one defined by mandatory solitude, where their essential public function was constantly undermined by profound personal revulsion. Their existence was a living contradiction, needed, yet despised. The medieval executioner, perpetually shrouded in mystery and darkness, was a figure both profoundly feared and utterly reviled, tasked with the grisly duty of carrying out society's most brutal punishments, bearing the weight of a heavy social stigma that extended far beyond the scaffold. The occupation of the executioner was widely regarded as dishonorable and shameful, a role thrust upon those who had few other options for survival, often inheriting the trade from disgraced or indebted forebears. Frequently, the position was passed down from one generation to the next, trapping entire families in a cycle of stigma and isolation, making intermarriage with non-executioner families extremely difficult. In some cases, individuals were forced into the role as a form of punishment or to repay a debt, ensuring that their lives would forever be marked by the indelible taint of their grim profession and denying them the right to choose their own fate. Within their communities, executioners were often treated as pariahs, actively avoided and shunned by their neighbors who considered them untouchable, believing their mere presence could bring misfortune and ill luck. This pervasive ostracism extended to nearly every aspect of their lives, dictating where they lived and severely limiting their opportunities for social interaction and trade. Executioners were often relegated to living on the outskirts of towns, near cemeteries, gallows, or other places associated with death and decay, enforcing a physical and symbolic boundary between them and polite society. Even when entering a city or town, they were sometimes required to announce their presence, allowing the residents to avoid them if they so desired, cementing their status as perpetually unwelcome outsiders. Despite their deep isolation, executioners were not entirely without means or resources, as in some cases they were provided with a modest income, housing, and even a degree of legal protection by the authorities that employed them. This official support, however, did little to counteract the pervasive social stigma that surrounded their lives and the scorn they faced from their fellow citizens, a bitterness that financial security could not assuage. The personal lives of executioners were similarly fraught with difficulty, as many struggled to form lasting relationships since few were willing to associate with someone who bore the taint of their profession. Marriages, if they occurred at all, were often arranged within families of executioners. ensuring that the stigma remained contained within their insular community, creating a self-perpetuating caste system of death. Despite the adversity they faced, some executioners managed to find a degree of respect within their profession, often based on their technical skill and adherence to duty. The aforementioned Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, who served as the city's official executioner for 45 years, kept a detailed journal of his work, providing a rare glimpse into the life and mindset of a man who carried out society's most grisly tasks, documenting his professionalism despite his social standing. Another tale that illuminates the complex relationship between executioners and the society that shunned them is the story of the legendary English executioner Jack Ketch, who served as the official executioner of London in the late 17th century, gaining a reputation for both his brutality and incompetence. Despite his infamy, Ketch managed to amass a small fortune through bribes and other illicit means, highlighting the uneasy transactional balance between the public's revulsion for the executioner and their unavoidable reliance on his services to maintain order. Blood money represented the grim rewards of the medieval executioner, a necessary financial incentive tied directly to the performance of state violence. Though lucrative, these earnings could never fully compensate for the accompanying social damnation. In the harsh, transactional world of the Middle Ages, the executioner served as the grim arbiter of justice, meting out punishments and enforcing the law in a society fraught with violence and upheaval. But while their profession was perpetually shrouded in darkness and stigma, these enigmatic figures were not without their necessary financial rewards, ensuring the state had a steady supply of men willing to take on the bloody work. Executioners in the Middle Ages were typically compensated in several distinct ways, with their earnings varying significantly depending on the region and the specific circumstances of their employment. One common form of payment was a fixed salary provided by the local authorities who employed them, offering a degree of financial security, though it was often modest compared to the earnings of other skilled tradesmen who were not social pariahs. In addition to their base salary, executioners were often entitled to specific fees for performing specific tasks, formalizing the payment schedule for death. These fees could vary depending on the complexity and severity of the punishment being administered, with particularly gruesome or high-profile executions commanding predictably higher prices, tying the executioner's income directly to the violence required. For example, an executioner might receive a relatively small fee for carrying out a simple hanging, while more elaborate and grisly methods such as drawing and quartering or burning at the stake might fetch a significant premium. Executioners were also sometimes granted additional perks and benefits as part of their compensation package, recognizing their unique vulnerability and necessity. In certain regions, they were given a measure of legal protection, ensuring that they could not be prosecuted for acts committed in the course of their duties, which was crucial given the violent nature of their work and the potential for retribution from the families of those they executed. One particularly curious and macabre aspect of the executioner's compensation was the practice of granting them the right to claim the belongings of the condemned, often right down to the clothes on their back. This grim form of inheritance could prove quite lucrative, particularly in cases where the victim was a wealthy or high-ranking individual, effectively turning judicial process into a form of involuntary wealth transfer. Executioners might also be entitled to a portion of the fines levied against the condemned or their families, further sweetening the pot for those willing to engage in this dark profession. Despite the various forms of compensation available to executioners, their financial prospects were often uncertain, and many struggled to make ends meet, especially in leaner times when executions were infrequent. This precarious financial position led some executioners to seek additional income through less savory means, often skirting the very laws they were meant to uphold. For example, they might accept bribes from the condemned or their families in exchange for a swift and merciful death, or even engage in the illicit trade of body parts, selling the remains of their victims to medical professionals or collectors seeking anatomical specimens. A horrifying side. Business rooted in necessity. Grim shadows represent the hidden torment of the medieval executioner, revealing that the performance of mandated violence left deep, unavoidable psychological scars on those tasked with administering it. The professional demands of the job were fundamentally antithetical to mental health. In the unforgiving world of the Middle Ages, the executioner played a vital yet reviled role, dispensing brutal justice and instilling fear in the hearts of the populace. But while their profession earned them a living, it also exacted a heavy, unavoidable psychological toll on those who wielded the axe or the noose. To be an executioner was to be intimately, routinely familiar with death, pain, and human suffering, carrying out repeated, formalized acts of killing. Day after day, these individuals were tasked with taking the lives of their fellow humans, often in the most brutal and agonizing ways imaginable, necessitating a profound emotional dissociation from their humanity. This grim duty inevitably left a deep mark on their psyche, with many executioners grappling with feelings of guilt, remorse, and despair, struggling to reconcile their faith with their profession. The constant exposure to public violence and death could also result in symptoms similar to what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, with the executioner haunted by intrusive flashbacks and nightmares long after the axe had fallen. In the face of this overwhelming psychological torment, executioners developed various coping mechanisms to protect their mental health and maintain a semblance of stability in their highly unstable lives. One such strategy was to rigidly view their work as a necessary duty, an essential service they provided to society in order to maintain law and order, framing their actions as cold, clinical procedures. By framing their actions as a form of divine justice, they could distance themselves from the immediate brutality of their deeds and find solace in the belief that they were acting in accordance with a higher, necessary purpose. Another coping mechanism employed by some executioners was to focus intensely on the technical aspects of their work, honing their skills and taking pride in their expertise, reducing the human victim to a problem of precision. By concentrating on the clinical efficiency of their methods, they could distance themselves from the inherent cruelty of their actions and derive professional satisfaction from their mastery of a difficult and demanding craft. Despite these coping strategies, the psychological burden of their profession could still prove overwhelming for some executioners, breaking down their emotional defenses. Alcoholism, severe depression, and other forms of mental illness were not uncommon among these individuals as they sought to numb the pain and silence the ghosts that haunted their thoughts, leading to cycles of dependency and despair. One poignant example of the emotional turmoil faced by executioners can be found in the story of Charles-Henri Sanson, the chief executioner of France during the French Revolution, a time of unprecedented bloodshed. In his memoirs, Sanson describes the profound guilt and regret he felt after executing King Louis V, confessing that he was tormented by the memory of the fallen monarch and struggled desperately to reconcile his official actions with his personal conscience. This powerful account serves as a stark reminder of the complex and often anguished emotional landscape that lay beneath the executioner's concealing hood. Between heaven and hell, the rituals of the medieval executioner turned state violence into formalized performance, ensuring that every act of killing was governed by strict custom and imbued with religious justification. These rituals were essential to maintain order both on the scaffold and within the executioner's own psyche. In the shadowy world of the medieval executioner, the line between life and death was a fine one, and the detailed rituals that surrounded their grim work were charged with both symbolic and intense practical significance for all involved. Before an execution, the executioner would often engage in a series of preparatory rituals, both to ensure the smooth, uninterrupted running of the event and to invoke divine protection and guidance for the terrible task ahead. One such practice was the meticulous testing and maintenance of their tools and equipment, essential to prevent the embarrassment and chaos of a botched job. The blade of the axe or sword would be sharpened and polished, the rope of the gallows inspected for flaws, and the machinery of the breaking wheel or the rack carefully calibrated, ensuring lethal efficiency. By attending to these practical, methodical details, the executioner sought to minimize the risk of error and ensure a swift and efficient death for the condemned, fulfilling their professional obligation. Beyond the practical aspects of their work, executioners were also keenly aware of the spiritual dimensions of their profession, often seeking absolution for their actions through formal religious practices. In many cases, they would engage in prayer and other devotional practices before an execution, seeking forgiveness for their actions and invoking the divine support of their patron saints, a necessary attempt to rationalize their work within Christian morality. This sacred element of their work served to reinforce the idea that they were acting as agents of divine justice, helping them to cope with the immense moral and ethical challenges of their trade. During the execution itself, the rituals and customs that governed the proceedings varied depending on the method of execution and the local traditions of the region, but they always required strict adherence to form. In some cases, the condemned would be granted a final meal or the opportunity to confess their sins before a priest, while in others they would be subjected to a public display of humiliation and suffering designed to serve as a stark deterrent to others. The executioner would often play a central role in these ceremonies, acting as both the instrument of justice and the physical embodiment of society's collective rage and retribution. Once the execution had been carried out, the executioner's responsibilities did not end. They were often charged with disposing of the remains, whether by burial, cremation, or other, more gruesome means. In some cases, the bodies of the executed would be put on public display as a warning to others, with the executioner tasked with arranging the gruesome tableau in a visible location. In other instances, they would be responsible for distributing the remains to medical professionals or collectors who valued them for their educational or macabre appeal, extending their duties into the realm of human disposal. The Dark Emperors, notorious executioners of the ages, stand as monumental figures in history, their actions defining moments of extreme state power and public horror. Their fame was an ironic consequence of the violence they professionally enacted. In the grim annals of history, the names of certain executioners stand out, etched in infamy for their role in shaping the course of events and the immediate destinies of those who crossed their path at the scaffold. Our journey begins with the enigmatic figure of Franz Schmidt, a German executioner who plied his trade in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, whose notoriety came not from cruelty, but from sheer volume and careful documentation. Hailing from a family of executioners, Schmidt was known for his exceptional skill and professionalism, carrying out more than 350 executions over the course of his 45-year career, meticulously documenting each act in his personal journal. As we travel across the Channel to England, we encounter the notorious figure of Jack Ketch, an English executioner whose name has become synonymous with brutality and incompetence, a reputation that cemented his historical legacy. Active during the late 17th century, Ketch's gruesome reputation was cemented by a series of botched executions, most notably that of the Duke of Monmouth in 1685, a high-profile execution that went terribly wrong. During this ill-fated event, Ketch is said to have taken 5 blows to sever the Duke's head, with some accounts claiming that he resorted to using a knife to complete the grisly task, resulting in national infamy. Across the Atlantic, we find the enigmatic figure of Tom Horn, a legendary scout and lawman of the American West, who also served as an executioner during the latter years of the 19th century, reflecting the rough, frontier nature of justice. Horn's career as an executioner was often marked by controversy, with many questioning the legality and morality of his methods, blurring the line between sanctioned killer and hired gun. He is perhaps best remembered for his role in the hanging of William Willie Nickel, a young man accused of cattle rustling, an act that would ultimately lead to Horn's own highly controversial execution in 1903. Returning to the European continent, we encounter the chilling figure of Anatole Dible, a French executioner who presided over the guillotine during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, inheriting the mantle of Sanson. Known for his cold efficiency and rigid professionalism, Dible executed over 400 people during his tenure, including the infamous anarchist Ravachol and the notorious serial killer Henri Landru, making him a central figure in French criminal justice history. Despite the grim nature of his work, Dible was a private and reserved man, actively shunning the spotlight and striving to maintain a semblance of normalcy in his personal life, a characteristic necessity for men in his role. A macabre spectacle, the theater of public executions in the Middle Ages was designed to be a high-stakes, terrifying public lesson, where the law was physically and violently asserted before the gathered populace. The audience was as vital to the execution as the executioner himself. In the turbulent world of the Middle Ages, public executions were a grim and ubiquitous fixture of society, casting their long shadow over the lives of the highborn and the lowly alike, serving as a societal ritual. To understand the complex tapestry of emotions, motivations, and desires that bound these brutal spectacles to the hearts and minds of their audience, we must delve into the multifaceted role they played in the medieval world. In an age before television and mass communication, public executions offered a morbid, free form of entertainment for the masses, drawing large crowds eager for the visceral thrill of the spectacle, often treated like a holiday outing. The gruesome details of the condemned's fate would often be announced in advance, and the crowd would gather early to secure the best vantage points, while hawkers would sell food and drink, creating a carnival-like atmosphere around impending death. The crowd would jeer and mock the condemned, delighting in their suffering and degradation, finding a strange form of catharsis by projecting their own fears and frustrations onto the hapless scapegoat. Beyond their role as entertainment, public executions also served as a powerful, immediate deterrent to crime in a society where the rule of law was often tenuous at best. The authorities relied heavily on the visible threat of public punishment to maintain order and instill fear in the hearts of potential wrongdoers, acting as a constant reminder of the state's power. The grisly fate that awaited those who transgressed the boundaries of acceptable behavior was intended to serve as a stark warning to others, a vivid, physical reminder of the brutal consequences of stepping outside the narrow confines of the law. In this way, public executions were a vital tool in the arsenal of medieval law enforcement, a stark, visceral reminder of the ever-present threat of retribution that loomed over the lives of those who dared to defy the established order. At their core, public executions were also a potent display of authority and power, meant to project the absolute dominion of the sovereign. By meting out punishment in such a public and brutal fashion, the ruling classes sought to assert their dominion over the lives of their subjects and reinforce the idea that they were the ultimate arbiters of life and death. The physical presence of high-ranking officials at these events underscored this political message, lending the weight of their authority to the proceedings and ensuring that the audience was left in no doubt as to who held the reins of power. In this way, public executions served as a form of political theater, a stage upon which the ruling classes could demonstrate their iron control over the forces of chaos and disorder that continually threatened to engulf the medieval world. The evolution and transformation of the executioner's role is a reflection of society's slow, often painful progress away from public cruelty and toward more formalized, less visible forms of ultimate punishment. The journey tracks the changing public conscience regarding state violence. The role of the executioner has undergone significant, dramatic changes throughout history, shaped fundamentally by the shifting tides of public opinion, advances in technology, and the evolving moral understanding of justice and punishment. This journey from the dark corners of the Middle Ages to the more enlightened modern era reflects the broader, often turbulent transformation of society itself and offers a unique window into the ever-changing landscape of human morality. In the Middle Ages, the executioner was a raw figure of fear and dread, an embodiment of society's most primal instincts for vengeance and retribution, operating largely unchecked by modern ethical constraints. Cloaked in anonymity and armed with the crude tools of their grim trade, these individuals held the absolute power of life and death in their hands, meting out brutal punishment at the specific behest of their masters. As public opinion began to shift, however, particularly with the philosophical currents of the Enlightenment, the role of the executioner began its slow, inevitable transformation. The Enlightenment brought about powerful new ideas and values, leading to a profound societal reassessment of the morality of capital punishment and the specific place of the executioner in society. This transformation was further accelerated by the rise of new, purportedly more humane technologies, such as the guillotine, which promised a more precise and efficient method of execution. Invented in the late 18th century by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, the guillotine was intended to democratize the process of execution, ensuring that all condemned individuals, regardless of their social status, would meet the same swift and theoretically painless end. This technological development marked a crucial turning point in